Welcome to another edition of the Brooklyn in the 2010s podcast, where I talk about what I saw and experienced in the New York City borough of Brooklyn from about 2009 to 2019. So tonight I want to talk about New York City's public housing, also commonly called the quote-unquote projects. So in other videos, I've talked about how Brooklyn underwent tremendous development in the 2010s, but also it kind of kept one foot in the past too. So the projects is an interesting way to look at this because they are found, the public housing, is found all over Brooklyn in many different areas, and especially in the areas that underwent a lot of rapid development, like parts of North Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, in Bushwick, in the downtown Brooklyn neighborhoods by the Brooklyn Bridge. So there's a lot to talk about there. What were these places like? What had they been like in the past, and what were they like in the 2010s as I saw them? Again, this is not a podcast that is researched. I'm mostly going to talk about what people told me and what I saw. So, just to a little background, I socialized, lived, and worked in Brooklyn during the period of time from about 2008, 2009 to 2019. And I was, during a lot of this time, was a contractor. So my job involved me going all over Brooklyn, working all over Brooklyn, spending considerable amounts of time in many, many neighborhoods throughout the borough. So I saw a lot and learned a lot. Now, what did I see and learn about the projects? First got to know let me start. What are the projects? What is New York City public housing? New York City public housing is housing, generally apartments, that is owned or in some cases subsidized by the New York City government. Um, if we talk about NYCHA, which is New York City Public Housing Authority, it's actually listed as a state public development corporation. So I believe there's involvement from the state in this. The actual definition on Wikipedia is for NYCHA, New York City Public Housing Authority, a New York State public development corporation which provides public housing in New York City. Also administers a citywide Section 8 leased housing program in rental apartments. Okay, so there's a basic definition. Like I said, this housing is to be found all over Brooklyn from what I saw. I wouldn't say every neighborhood, like I don't believe that there's housing projects in Gerritsen Beach that I remember, but you do find it in some of the more less well-known areas like Sheepshead Bay, for example. So yeah, I believe I saw one in Bay Ridge too. I don't believe like Gravesend or those places, but they're located throughout the borough is basically what you have to know. And you'll see them, and they'll often be like a sign outside of the building that will have the name of the complex, that public housing complex. Like sometimes it's named after, a historical figure or like a geographic location or something like that. Sometimes it's just like the Williamsburg houses, the Brownsville houses, for example. So that's yeah, you'll see a sign, and often in Brooklyn, from my experience, they were generally like multi-level towers, some often with elevators in them. Although not all of them, I believe in Bed-Stuy, like around Gates Avenue, there were some that were just like 2 to 3 stories tall and didn't have. I don't remember. They might have had elevators, but it's possible they didn't. But many are multi stories, like 10 stories or more. Um, there's a they generally like kind of have a similar look. Most of them, in my experience, like they're brick buildings, um, and there'll often be like a lot of them clustered together, and they'll all have like building number whatever. It'll be like on the side of the building, you'll see it. They'll have different addresses, all within the same complex. And there'll be a lot of times like in the larger complexes like some kind of courtyard between the buildings. They'll often be like clustered together. They may take several blocks, but they'll be like the particular housing complex will be clustered together. And like I said, there'll be courtyard, sometimes like a community center or something like that, basketball courts, and like lawns and things like that, parking lots for people who live there. Um, and when I was growing up, like the quote unquote projects always had a very bad reputation, and especially like 80s and 90s were kind of seen as like no go places, like you didn't want to be there. You just heard so many bad things about them, like as centers of poverty and violence, drugs. Typically, I lived by the Cooper houses in Greenpoint. I mean, I wouldn't say it was someplace that you wanted to go all the time, but during the daytime, like you could walk around there, walk through there, and I found that to be the case in most of the public housing that I worked in throughout the borough. I mean, if it was daytime, you could walk through, and they were decent, pleasant places to walk through. Like they had, like I said, they had these lawns, and often they were fairly well maintained. I wouldn't say it was anything beautiful. Nothing about New York City public housing is beautiful, but in general, I didn't find it to be like as like aesthetically terrible. They had people working there at these places, and I'd see them doing their jobs, and they did a decent job, I thought, of the grounds at least. Um, so that's the look of that from the outside of New York City public housing. A lot of masonry, a lot of brick. Not aesthetically pleasing. Just basic towers. And they're old buildings from what I understand. Like they're all like at least 50, 60 years old. So they've been around a while. A lot of times like you'd see like awnings around them. Just I guess they need a lot of maintenance, so there's people constantly working on them. And so yeah, that's the outside. So um, you know the interiors of these towers or buildings, generally like pretty ugly, I'd say. Just a lot of these like yellow colored stones, in the lobbies, kind of these very like huge like metal doors that you walked in to get into the building. I mean, these doors were just like, they must have been so heavy. They were very thick. And nothing special in the lobbies ever from what I can remember. Just very basic or kind of ugly. Sometimes they'd be like kind of dirty looking. Like I said, they're old buildings and they're public housing, so they're no frills for the most part. They'd have elevators, in a lot of them. The elevators could be like, kind of disgusting sometimes, like particularly on like, Saturday or something like that. But they always worked. I'll say that. Like I don't ever remember a time where they didn't work. So there's definitely some degree of maintenance that was going on in these places. I did hear from residents who I worked for that when you had some kind of maintenance request, like sometimes there could be a long wait or something like that. I heard it was difficult to like because they're old buildings, they predated sheetrocking on the walls that kind of making repairs in walls and things like that was kind of a real task, like using like outdated old fashioned methods. um, I don't believe people had thermostats in these buildings, so more often than not, like in the winter, I mean, they would just be like piping hot. I mean, just really hot in them. Although I did hear, there was quite a story in the New York City news about like several that didn't have working heat through periods of time. I believe around like 2018, 2019. The apartments themselves, on the face of it, they, pretty basic to, a lot of, like I said, a lot of masonry. I kind of remember like, the hallways, like between rooms were pretty narrow. They'd often have like a living room, which varied in size. Some of them were kind of big, some of them weren't. And, just the windows would be basic and everything. I don't remember, a lot of light in these places. I guess because it had a lot of masonry and like the windows weren't that big, like they kind of felt a little dark. But as far as the apartments themselves, it really varied from person to person who lived there. Same with other houses, like other places I've seen people live in. Some of them, I mean, some of these apartments were really beautiful and much nicer than places I've lived in throughout my life. Some people did really great jobs with them. Um, and really you could see put a lot of work in. I think I even remember one guy. I noticed, I was like looking around and I'm like, wait, it seems like you do have sheetrock in here. And he's like, yeah, I put up sheetrock, or on top of the masonry, stone or concrete walls. um, so yeah, huge variation in what the apartments looked like. Some of them were really really nice. Um, yeah. I mean, I could tell a lot of stories about that. Like just really like being like taken aback by how nice some of these places were, and some of them weren't. Some of them were just kind of gross, but and everything in between. I can't really generalize and say that they were this way or that way. There was really a huge variation in all the different houses that I worked in when I worked in many of them in Brooklyn. Um, like I said, the projects, like throughout the when I was growing up, the early part of my life in Staten Island, we didn't have them, but we definitely heard about them from people who worked there, or just heard things about them just by living in New York City. And pretty much it was a bad reputation, seen as a place of poverty, violence, and drugs. I remember hearing from like somebody who had been New York City housing cop, which was, I believe, what they used to call the officers who worked in public housing, telling me some bad stories about like the Marcy projects in Brooklyn, where I believe Jay-Z lived for a lot of his childhood. He told me like in the 80s, like, seeing people shooting up out in the open. Um, I heard stories about the ones in Bushwick and about gangs and things like that. Um, so definitely, some people told me about stories back in the day, how things used to be. Now, there was an overall impression in New York City throughout the 2010s that crime, gang violence was way down. This was particularly true of like, the rate of homicides seemed to be way down from like their peak in the early 90s. Um, and I never myself saw any robberies, muggings, uh, drug use. I maybe witnessed some drug dealing, but never actually like was very open to me. Um, so I myself never saw any crimes take place in these houses throughout the years I worked there. Like I've said in other videos, I only worked in the daytime generally, or maybe the early evening. I never lived in these places. I did hear about like, kids in gangs from people who I worked for, and, quite a lot of complaints about that, about, kids committing crimes and being in gangs and things like that. So definitely got the impression that it was still going on. And a few times, like I walked into these buildings and there would be like wanted signs for somebody who committed crimes there. I remember seeing maybe a couple times for murder, and it would be like murders of teenagers, for example. And so, you'd see like maybe a 17-year-old kid got murdered in the same building I was working in recently. Um, so you knew it was still there. I think like the Red Hook houses, like I arrived one morning and like a murder had just been committed the day before. The police were still there, so it was for sure like, some of these crimes were still going on as they had in decades past, but um, possibly not on the level that they were in those decades, the 80s and 90s. Um, I never got the impression that, the projects were, completely like depressing place, from what I saw. Definitely like not a place like, anybody I think would aspire to be, but possibly also not what some people may have thought they were from the outside. Um, they're places for lower income people, and that's what you'll find there. Like you're not going to find people dressed up in expensive clothes, and often not like driving expensive cars. Like it is what it is. I can say for sure that the racial makeup of the projects, from what I saw, I'm not going by any statistics, any research, but it was overwhelmingly um, a black or Hispanic, and that was just what I saw over and over again in many different of New York City public housing, and especially in Brooklyn. Like like in certain parts of like Manhattan, like in public housing, you might see like Chinese immigrants in like around Chinatown or downtown Manhattan, for example. But typically in Brooklyn, they were either black or Hispanic. Like here and there, a few white people, like I remember once, like in Sheepshead Bay houses, for example, maybe once or twice, saw white people who, or worked for white people who were living there. But yeah, I mean, it just really seemed to be overwhelmingly minorities, Hispanic and Black. And uh, so this was, like in certain neighborhoods that had gentrified in a way, the racial makeup of the overall neighborhood had possibly shifted to more whites and to some extent Asians. But if there was significant public housing, like in Bed-Stuy, for example, or Bushwick, there were still going to be a lot of minorities still living there, and keeping some continuity with often the way that the racial makeup was before gentrification. So that was something that I observed, overwhelmingly. Um, and that's about all I have to say about um, the projects. I welcome any questions you may have about them, any comments. Again, this is not like a research podcast. I'm just talking about what I saw at my time there, and just kind of relating it to you guys. So yeah, if you should have, it's just one man's testimony, just to provide information about a time period and Brooklyn's history. So that's it. Give a thumbs up if you liked it. Let me know if you have suggestions for other videos about Brooklyn in the 2010s. Let's get a discussion going. So have a good night, and I will let you know when the next video's out. Thanks.